All right, so we have a few questions for you today about your book, about your studies, and we're excited to get into it. So first, what was your main motivation for writing The Death of the Nation? The Death of the Nation?
It's a good question, but sometimes these kind of books are not prepared.
Okay.
You know, I didn't sit down and think I want to write this book. For about a quarter of a century now, almost 25 years, I've worked pretty much as a full-time journalist on the side.
Okay.
Not really on the side. You know, what does on the side mean? It starts to interrupt the rest of your life. So, at least since the US war on Iraq in 2003, I've over the years covered aspects of this war as it spread, you know, from Iraq, well, really from Afghanistan, which on 7th of October 2016 will have been 15 years old itself. It's an amazing thing that the war in Afghanistan has been 15 years running now. And anyway, so, you know, I accumulated a series of stories, whether it's in Libya or in Egypt or Syria or wherever, as I traveled and reported this for various news outlets. You know, Turkey is another place. You know, as I accumulated stories, I realized that there's a larger story to tell. And, you know, so I didn't sit down and say, let me go research for this book. I was doing these stories, and at a certain point it occurred to me that the stories, which are all about, you know, snapshots of events that take place, in a sense, those snapshots relied upon a much larger narrative. And that's why I wanted to write that narrative.
Great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So you kind of talked a little bit about this upcoming anniversary, and so what is your current mood or attitude towards the Middle East and the Arab world? Like, as of now, are you hopeful or frustrated, or what are you thinking?
Well, let's start with Afghanistan, which is in some ways outside, you know, the Middle East proper, but, you know, not in terms of U.S. strategy. They see it all as one area. You know, the US war in Afghanistan, which started in 2001, wasn't the beginning of the engagement in Afghanistan. In a sense, this war began in 1979. And so many of the problems that have plagued the world since 2001, 9/11, are actually rooted in the history from 1979, when the West went into Afghanistan with the Saudis, with the Pakistanis, to overthrow the communist government. That's when, for instance, Osama bin Laden comes to Afghanistan. That's when Al-Qaeda is formulated as a project, etc. So this story of Afghanistan is actually central to the region. But how can one be optimistic about the outcomes? 15 years of war, and the Taliban has returned in the countryside. The Taliban is threatening 3 provincial capitals, one of them in the north, which is not its main base area, but the city of Kunduz, where it has had support for very many years. In the south, in Helmand province, where the Americans had conducted the surge, the Taliban is basically back in more than half the districts of Helmand province. So I think it's correct to be gloomy about the prospects. And, you know, if the horizon now is merely peace agreements, ceasefires, you know, this is a very low expectation to go from making the world a better place, transforming the world into a place where children can be born and say, wow, you know, I can do interesting things. After all, isn't that what life is for? Is for you to turn to generations to come and say, you too can do interesting things. What's the goal of life? Not to have a career, but to do interesting things, right? So you say we're so far from that, where the fact of having a ceasefire has become a major goal. You know, you can't think of making the world a better place in many of these places because the resources, the human resources to do that are no longer available. Let me give you just a statistic, just to think about this with some clarity. In the 1970s and into the early 1980s, 50% of civil servants in Afghanistan were women. 70% of teachers in Afghanistan were women. and 40% of doctors in Afghanistan were women. This is exactly the dynamic that the West, the Saudis and the Pakistanis destroyed. They backed people such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who had made it his mission as a university student to walk up to young women studying in Kabul University and throw acid in their face. He was the ally of the United States in Afghanistan, not the people who were the 50% civil servant women. Do you understand what I mean? Those resources, human, are no longer available. They've been pushed into exile, their hearts have been broken, they are no longer around to make a world where children can wake up and say, I want to be able to do anything. We're at the point now where we're just looking for ceasefires. It's a very low horizon.
Yeah, thank you for that. How do you think that the intensifying Turkish maelstrom could be remedied? Do you have any ideas for that? You touched on it in your book, but I'd like to know a little more.
Turkey is a very, very complicated world. If you go back to the formation of the modern state of Turkey, of course there's blood and genocide right there, but there's also the attempt to modernize Turkey by disregarding, in a sense, the people's cultural worlds. And this was a very much shared modernizing zeal. Modernity was supposed to be brought to rural parts of the world on a tank, not with education. People were to be told, you can't behave like that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And there's a kind of brusqueness, and I understand the zeal in a way, because there was an idea that, this is how the world should be. People should read, people should have science, There was a zeal to this. But that zealotry set aside older traditions. And it never actually killed them off, it set them underground. So, in different countries we've seen as the economies of the country start to tank, those older lineages reappear. And people start to say, look, we can't, okay, fine, we can't tell our kids to do interesting things, but then we can live a certain honorable way, and this brings in older traditional things. So in Turkish society, there was a rise of a kind of traditionalism in Anatolia. And this Anatolian kind of conservatism came simultaneously with the rise of new business, small business, middle business elites. And they became the base of the AKP party, which is the party in power and is very solidly in power. And, in a sense, this party, which is a branch of the broad Muslim Brotherhood current, is unshakable in Turkey. And, the left is marginalized, the old sort of Republican elites are marginalized, and this section is in power. Now, you can't dispose of this section by military coups. It's not the way to go. You can't dispose of this section by sneering at it. Alternative projects need to be created. What is the project of a Turkish left, say, the HDP party and others? What is the project? What are they telling the Anatolian business people or the workers of Turkey who work in mines and factories? What are they offering them as an alternative? And until we have the ability to dream of alternatives, Turkey is going to be stuck in this rut. And this rut is dangerous for the region. You said, where will the Turkish maelstroms roll? Well, the Turkish government took such a forward policy on Syria, saying we got to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, that it committed itself to something which I think its own intelligence knew could not happen easily. And it got sucked into the war. So rather than Turkey overthrow Syria is really badly destroyed. Mm-hmm. Turkey has now begun to experience the maelstrom. In southeastern Turkey, southeastern Turkey, there's now a renewed attack on the Kurds. And so Turkey is in crisis, but you can't change Turkish political life and culture unless you tackle the social forces inside Turkey, which are at the moment disposed to the AKP. And there are no alternatives. You can't just sit and bemoan the problem of Turkey. You need an alternative project to capture the imagination of the social forces who right now are either gloomy or they see the AKP as some salvation.
Okay.
Do you have an idea? You talked about an alternative project. Do you have like an idea of what that could be, or like a direction to take that in, or?
Sure, in our societies around the world, including in Pennsylvania, say, in much of the world, there is a global crisis, that people are experiencing. We haven't recovered from the housing crash and the credit crash, and I'm talking about globally. But really, this global crisis isn't rooted in the housing market in the United States. It's a crisis of capitalism. One of the great and powerful things about capitalism is able to very dynamically create an enormous number of commodities, enormous number of products, and to do so very efficiently. That's the really historical genius of capitalism. With great efficiency, it can produce vast amount of products. The problem for capitalism is its efficiency means that it begins to either displace labor, move to mechanization. So you no longer need so many people to work. So you have large pools of unemployed people. So the tendency to efficiency creates unemployment because it moves to mechanization or greater productivity of labor. If labor is more and more productive, why do you need so many workers? So you get, now as you have a number of people, larger pools of people unemployed, underemployed, etc., precariously employed, as you have, they don't have the money to buy the products. Because after all, capitalism can only work when it efficiently produces vast numbers of products and when somebody buys it. So there is an inherent crisis in capitalism which one sees over the 100 or 200 years. Is the inherent crisis of what is known as underconsumption and overproduction. Capitalism produces way too many goods and people are not able to consume them. So what happens is you go into debt. I don't know if you know that debt levels, not United States debt, which is 2 trillion, international debt levels are in the hundreds of trillions. Out of which 75% of it is privately held debt. US college debt is over $1 trillion. Student loan debt is over $1 trillion. So to close the gap between aspirations of people and this crazy crisis-driven system, people go into debt because they need to consume at a certain level. They can't consume as they used to, they don't have jobs. So what this does is it creates enormous social crises for people. And in the social crisis, you have either the rise of religion as an answer, so religious politics becomes an answer, xenophobic politics, like in Eastern Europe, you get the rise of xenophobic parties, or you get a Trump character, who is the answer to the social malaise and crisis, and a genuine answer. Trump is not an error. Trump is actually the correct answer to this crisis. Where people are frustrated, don't know answers anywhere, so you hate on somebody. It's happening all over the world. Why shouldn't it happen in America? People are surprised. Oh my God, Trump. Listen, this is happening all over the place. Erdogan is a kind of Trump. Mr. Urban in Poland is a kind of Trump. They're all, Mr. Modi in India, they're all elements of the same species, this species of jingoism, xenophobia, etc. So they don't have an answer to the crisis. And because anti-capitalism, critiques of capitalism are so hard to make in this climate, because of the penalty of the Soviet Union's collapse, etc. It's so hard to actually be heard when you make people don't take you seriously. You make a critique of capitalism, show that joblessness, etc. is not because there's bad management of the system. It's not because Obama did something wrong or Bill Clinton did something wrong. The system inherently is crisis-ridden and has this tendency. So we need alternative projects, but the confidence to articulate the alternative, given the severe penalty against critical thoughts about capitalism, makes it difficult to come out and say this is the alternative. So that's why I said we are in the age of the ceasefire. We are in the age of let's treat people nicely. Because people simply don't have the confidence politically to say what we need is a different system. There is no solution to these crises in this system. Because if the system itself is a jobs-eating system. And the answer is to create a system where people are able to work maybe 4 or 5 hours a day, have greater leisure. If they are more productive, hire more people to be more productive. There's greater leisure, greater ability to have participatory political societies where people who are 50 years old can go and learn another language. That's the society I want to live in. You know, where people go to work 4 hours a day because they're so productive and there are machines to help them. You know, there was a time when people worked 15 hours a day. Then they worked 12 hours a day. Then there was a big movement in America for the 10-hour day and then the 8-hour day. Now the day has been fixed for over 100 years at 8 hours. Why doesn't the day come down to 4 hours?
Thank you. Do you want me to keep going?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, the next question kind of, we already talked about it, but a little bit about how you kind of said like ceasefire is the next answer. But the question was just what do you think we will see, be able to see happen in the Arab world in the coming years? Do you think a ceasefire is a possibility, or do you think that that's just something that's going to take a long time?
You see, in Colombia, in South America, they've come close to ending a 52-year civil war. Civil wars last a very long time. In a way, the Afghan civil war, or whatever you call it, the war, regional, international war, has been going from 1979 to the present. In a way, the war on Iraq has been going since, is it 1990 to the present? You know, these are long wars. So Syria is in that sense merely in its 6th year. But the ferocity of the war, the scale of devastation is so great. 50% of the population displaced. You know, it's an extraordinary scale of collapse that I have for a long time hoped merely for a ceasefire. Now, ceasefires worked, but you know, there is no peace camp in the Syrian civil war. Nobody among the combatants says peace is my objective. So ceasefires, let's not be idealistic about it or naive. Ceasefires are merely a holding pattern. So at this point, the Syrian army, government, backed by Iranians, Russians, etc., know they can win in Aleppo. They are winning in Aleppo. They are going to take the city. So for them, at this point, a ceasefire is not on the cards because they're going to win in Aleppo. When they were losing or when there was a stalemate, there were ceasefires. So that over the last 2 years, there have been a series of important truces and ceasefires. This was because it was a stalemate situation. When Turkey went into its crisis and there was an attempted coup, and at that point, the Turkish government turned to the Russians because they blame America for instigating the coup. Mr. Gulen is your neighbor. So the Turks at the point, when they turned to Russia, and they said, we're going to start shutting down our proxies near Aleppo, there was a weakness now in the rebel camp because their supply lines to Turkey were not as well lubricated as they used to be. So the Syrian army made a dash into Aleppo because half the city was previously in government hands, now they are trying to take the other half. So one cannot be naive. The Syrian government isn't there to make peace. They are there to win the war. They are fighting a war. But nonetheless, the UN and others have to keep demanding, fighting, raising the flag of peace. Why? Even when you win a war, you have to bring the other side to the table at some point. If there is another side. You see, you can't just say that all the fighters in Syria are foreign fighters. There are many Syrians who are also fighting the government. They have to come to the table. The refugees will have to come home. So a peace agreement has to be created at some point. Now the Syrian government wants to create the peace agreement after they've taken Aleppo because they'll be in a position of extraordinary strength. So I understand their perspective. On the other hand, the other side, meaning the rebels and some of the refugees that fled the country, may not have confidence in a peace table if the government is so strong that they can dictate the terms of the peace. You see, so now when you say what is the exact situation, let's say in Syria, you said Arab, but let's just take Syria as an example. There's no direct line to anything. You can't say this, end of fighting. You can say that because there's no camp of peace in Syria today, no group has got guns and says we are committed to peace. See, everybody says they are committed to peace, but they're actually fighting a war. But you could have a camp that says actually we are committed, ready now, let's just sign an agreement, we are exhausted. Nobody is there. They all think they can win. That idea that you can win is a very dangerous idea because it prolongs wars for 52 years. Even now, the ex-president of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe, believes that the FARC is so weak in Colombia, they can win. Why have a peace agreement after 52 years of fighting? So he campaigned against the deal. Why not take the deal?
Thank you.
So a lot of these issues, I think, can possibly come back to the United Nations mandate of responsibility to protect. How do you feel that this mandate has further escalated these issues?
That's what I'm going to talk about today.
Okay.
So, but I can give you the
Maybe
5
a
seconds.
brief intro.
Sure. So, this mandate is an interesting mandate, but when it was first talked about, people warned on at least 2 angles. There were 2 basic problems with the mandate. One is, who gets to define when a situation is dire? Okay? Who gets to define? Because that's a core issue. Let's say I would say, when Israel is bombing Palestine, shouldn't there be no-fly zones? Shouldn't there be responsibility to protect? It's never going to happen. Let's not, again, be silly about this. This is not a universal mandate because of the power equations in the world. So the first question is, who gets to define? Second question is, who gets to follow through on the authorization? When the UN mandate says all member states should, by R2P under Chapter 7 of the thing, all member states, really? You think the next time Israel is bombing Gaza, you think if Iranian planes from an Iranian aircraft carrier flew into Egyptian airspace and then crossed over Gaza and started flying above Gaza, do you think that would be accepted? If the Iranians or if the Chinese came into a place and said, here's the R2P mandate, we are going to prosecute the mandate. Okay, in other words, we are going to fly planes to protect these people, they shouldn't be bombed. If the Burmese government is bombing the Rohingyas, they're not bombing them, but throwing them out of Burma, out of the Arakan region, and if the Indian government decides to send planes, let's just say, fantasy, send planes or ships, would the UN, would the geopolitical powers, meaning the United States, France, would they accept it? So R2P is limited by geopolitics, but it masquerades as a universal mandate. So then when the press says, civilians need to be protected, come on, who's decided which civilians should be protected?
Okay.
Where is the art? I heard once, I gave a talk once in Baltimore, and somebody stood up and said, where's the R2P for my community? We're getting killed by the police, is that?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, the next question we had was just a little bit about rulers, and the question was, how important is a legitimate ruler in the Middle East, and how can a ruler prove their legitimacy to the population?
This is a difficult question for any country. I mean, honestly, we are sitting in the middle of a presidential election in America. What is legitimacy of a ruler? Really? I mean, did either of you choose any of the presidential candidates to be the presidential candidate?
No.
So was your candidate is not running in the election. So now you'll say, well, one is better than the other, so I'll vote for them. Are they legitimate, therefore, by that count? I mean, okay, they didn't come by force. They didn't drive a tank into the White House. But they drove an armored car filled with money into the White House. Yeah. So now, to question legitimacy of places becomes complicated. Was George W. Bush a legitimate ruler in 2000? I mean, I'm not sure he won the election.
Yeah.
You went to, these people in black robes. See, people criticize Iran. This is the best thing, okay? Iran always gets in the neck. Dictatorship, authoritarian, etc. Why? Well, because anybody can put their name down to run for office, but then there is a group of elders that culls the list. They remove all the reformers, all the open-minded people. They only allow certain, very narrow, okay? This is like the primary process. What's the difference? I could run for the Democratic thing on some left-wing thing. Bernie ran on a left-wing thing. Okay, then suddenly in some back room somebody cut his name out, said, I don't think so. We're just going to drive the agenda this way. What's democratic? I mean, let's not get on a high horse when we judge legitimacy, because there is a crisis of legitimacy globally. There are referendums, okay, like Brexit. Was that a real referendum? I mean, really, the right-wing parties went against it, right? UKIP. They were the Brexit people. But then, the pretty much, just like them right-wing conservatives were against Brexit. If I was in Britain, I'd be confused. Where's the alternative? Either I vote with the far right or with the right. That's the way they've decided the referendum should operate. There's no place for a progress. I would be against being part of the European Union because if my political economic analysis, blah, all that stuff. But there's no room to vote there. So now legitimacy is difficult. Now obviously people are thirsting for some say in politics. That was what Tahrir Square, for instance, demonstrates, and not just Tahrir. In Iraq, in different places, people have been rising up saying, give us more say. Okay? But we don't really anywhere have a good model for how to capture say. I would perhaps hazard that Fidel Castro in the 1970s was more popular in Cuba than Nixon was in America. Even though Nixon had an election and was elected president. I think his popularity was lower. He was disliked more than Castro was in Cuba. I think even if you add Cuban exiles, Castro probably had a higher positive, because the Cuban population is larger than the exile population, the percentage than Nixon. So obviously countries need to, and populations need to have more claim on the space of politics, obviously. But how that happens and what it looks like is hard. Remember, I gave you the story of Turkey. Now, I might not like the AKP. I don't like their policies, the direction, etc. But they've been able to capture sections of the popular imagination. And they're very good politicians. The coup happened, they had 1 million plus people come for a rally to save Turkey. My friends went for that rally. They stood behind Erdogan, So what is legitimacy?
Thank you.
Thank you, that was insightful.
Please.
So also, in your book, you criticized United States foreign policy and their intervention into the Middle East. What do you think that the United States could do rather than what we've seen in the past to actually be beneficial to places like Syria or Turkey or anything that really,
See, US policy is constrained by two alliances that are corrosive. One is Israel, the other is Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are the two most corrosive alliances. So US foreign policy is not independent. It's actually formed through Tel Aviv and Riyadh. And it's constrained by that. I mean, here's Riyadh for over a year bombing Yemen to smithereens. And nobody's saying anything. There's no R2P conversation. There's no attempt. Nobody says, the king of Saudi Arabia is a butcher. He should go. See the language they use on Assad. Assad should go. I mean, at no point have we heard the American president say the king of Saudi Arabia is illegitimate. he's bombing Yemen brutally, should stop, we don't hear it. So United States has no credibility.
Okay.
So you can't actually have any kind of foreign policy if you have no credibility. What you have is power.
Yeah.
And power is not enough of an engine to shape the world. Power can force things, but it can't shape things. So until the United States has credibility, it's of no use. It's merely a powerful force. It's merely like, let's say, not to be unfair to animals, but it's like if you have an elephant. I don't know if you know, when an elephant goes must, it just sort of loses its head and just goes crazy. Literally, it thrashes about. And elephants are very powerful and strong animals. Generally, they are quite peaceful and calm, but when it goes crazy, it smashes into things. The United States behaves like an elephant gone must.
Okay.
But it cannot command because it has no legitimacy. Everybody underneath smiles when the Americans talk in high moral language. They're like, they say, oh, very nice to see you, you're the most important country in the world. That's because they're powerful, not because they are loved. You can't be loved if your greatest ally is the King of Saudi Arabia and the government of Israel.
Thank you.
Our next question is kind of more specific about what you wrote in the book, and it was, you talked a little bit earlier about being a journalist and how it was part of your life. So how did you choose the specific people that you cited in your book? Okay, yeah. How did you pick who to cite in your book and who to include? How did you decide which ones were important enough to be added into?
You mean the stories, the people I talked to?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, I like to meet interesting people. And perhaps the most interesting story, I met a lot of people who were financiers of the Syrian war, different levels of financiers, Syrians, I met a Qatari guy, whatever. But the most interesting guy I met was the Syrian financier. And he was interesting because he was honest. And, he was clear that, listen, I was big on the revolution, but within almost weeks, the Saudis, Qataris came in and they put money into their proxies, and we lost control of what was going on. And, if I had got like a Iranian, intellectual to say that, that's not credible, as it is this guy who was financing the revolt, who threw everything in, who had to leave the country. And then he says, I was scared of my so-called allies. I thought that was really interesting. I trusted him. Mm-hmm. And he still hates the government of Bashar al-Assad. But he recognizes there is no other alternative than a ceasefire. Now again, he's not naive. Like me, he understands everybody wants to win. But still, you got to fight for the middle ground, for the grey zone, as it were.
Thank you. We, I guess, have to finish up here a little bit, but is there anything else that you would like to say or include?
Nothing. I'm looking forward to having a conversation about responsibility to protect.
Fantastic.
Partly, it's such a great illusion in our times that it's important for people to think about it.
Thank you so much for your
Pleasure.
time. It's been illuminating.
Thanks.